The ground at FOB drain makes a sound before it moves. I know that now. At 0217 on a Tuesday in November, I heard it. A low, dry settling, like a pallet of sandbags shifted 6 inches underground, and I stood up from the duty desk before I understood why. By the time I understood why, she had already been at the sensor console for 4 minutes. I want to go back to the afternoon before, because that is where this story starts. Not at 0217. At 1440, in the equipment tent, with the sun angling hard through the canvas flap and Lieutenant Colonel Breckett standing with his hands on his belt loops, looking at her monitoring rig the way a man looks at something he has already decided is in the wrong place. Her name was Chief Warrant Officer 2 Maren Voss, retired. She had been at FOB Drain for 11 weeks when Breckett arrived to assume temporary command during the handover gap, the 3-week window between Colonel Aldrin rotating out and the permanent replacement flying in. Voss was listed in our duty roster as a contractor, civilian technical advisor, subsurface threat assessment. She had a folding table near the back of the equipment tent, a laptop, and a grid of sensors she had spent the first 3 weeks placing herself, on foot, across the perimeter and the dry lakebed beyond it. Thin aluminum stakes, hand-built receivers, wired back to a single rack-mounted unit she had assembled from parts she had requisitioned, through channels nobody questioned, because the paperwork was clean and the part numbers were unremarkable. I had watched her place those sensors on 12 separate mornings. I had not asked what they were for. That is the first thing I write down when I think about those 11 weeks. I watched, and I did not ask. "Chief," Breckett said, and he did not say it unkindly, which was almost worse. "I need this tent for the command post expansion. We're running 2 command elements out of 1 room, and that's not sustainable." She looked up from the screen. She had gray at her temples, and a way of holding still that made the space around her feel quieter than it was. "The sensor grid needs the rack unit on site to process," she said. "If you relocate the tent, I lose real-time read on the perimeter." Breckett looked at the rack unit. He looked at the screen, which showed a grid overlaid with elevation-corrected depth readings, in colors she had explained to me once: blue for stable substrate, amber for monitored variance, red for active anomaly. There was a cluster of red in the northwest quadrant that had been there for 9 days. I had looked at it every morning when I came in for the shift brief. I had not asked about that either. He looked at me. I was the senior NCO in the tent, Master Sergeant Aldous Kell, 14 years in infantry operations, 2 tours that mattered and several that didn't. I said nothing. I am writing that down because it is the part I have to live with. "What is the sensor grid currently telling us?" Breckett asked. "Subsurface movement," she said. "The pattern is consistent with hand-excavated tunneling. I have 3 months of baseline data. The anomaly started 9 days ago and has been widening at approximately 4 centimeters per day." He tilted his head, the way a man does when he has already made a decision and is now performing consideration. "Subsurface movement," he said, "on a dry lake bed." "Yes, sir. Chief Voss." He said it the way you say a name when you're about to explain something simple to someone who has complicated it. "I've read your contract scope, threat assessment, subsurface and seismic. I appreciate the diligence, but we've had no ground-penetrating radar confirmation, no signals intelligence suggesting tunnel activity in this sector, and no contact of any kind in 11 weeks. He paused. "I need the tent. I need the space. And frankly, what I need from you tonight is a full inventory of the supply stores in Building 4, because the outgoing element left those records incomplete and you are, by everyone's account, the most organized person on this post." Someone behind me made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. I recognized the voice. Corporal Taze, 22 years old, 3 months in theater, who had never once asked what the sensor stakes were for either. I did not turn around. She held still for a moment. Then she said, "The sensor array will take approximately 2 hours to break down properly." "Tonight," he said, "after the inventory." She nodded once and looked back at her screen. I went back to my desk. I wrote nothing down. I did not say, "Sir, I've watched her place those stakes for 3 weeks, every morning before it got hot." I did not say, "Sir, her paperwork is cleaner than anything this post has generated in 11 weeks. I did not say, "Sir, the red cluster in the northwest quadrant has been there for 9 days, and she has not once come to me alarmed," which means she is either wrong about it or she has already decided what to do when it matters. I said nothing, and Beckett walked out of the tent with his hands still on his belt loops, and 14 hours later, the ground at FOB Drain began to move. At 02:17, I stood up from the duty desk. She was already at the console. Not running, she had been there, I think, for some time before the sound reached me. The screen showed a lattice of red lines, a subsurface map I had never looked at closely, and she was tracing something with her finger across it, murmuring coordinates to herself, and her voice was completely level. "Master Sergeant." She didn't look up. "I'm here. The northern perimeter is compromised. I need you to get everyone out of Building 1 and move them to the secondary structure, southeast corner, the cinder block annex. Do not cross the central yard." I looked at the screen. The red lines converged at a point I recognized as directly beneath Building 1, the main billet, where 19 people were asleep. What am I looking at? Hand-dug lateral tunnels, significant volume, 8 to 10 feet of clearance from the surface. 9 days of progressive widening. The convergence point is here. She touched the screen. The soil column above it will not hold indefinitely. Based on the rate of movement in the last 4 hours, I estimate less than 90 minutes before primary collapse. Possibly less. "You're sure?" She looked at me then, just once. "Yes," she said. I went. I will not pretend I did not feel the doubt on the way across the compound. I have been in this work long enough to know what bad intelligence feels like. And I have been wrong before. And I know what it costs when you move people on a civilian contractor's word at 02:17 on a quiet night. I felt all of that. I moved everyone anyway, because the sound the ground had made was still in my boots, and because she had said yes without blinking, and because I had watched her work for 11 weeks without once finding a reason to doubt the paperwork, and this was not the moment to start. 19 people out of Building 1, 2 from the duty rotation, the 2 logistics staff who had been awake in the back office, 23 total, into the cinder block annex on the southeast side of the compound, which she had specified, and which I had not asked her to explain. She was on the radio when I came back. Not to hire. She didn't have the authority. To Sergeant Delva, our demolitions NCO, who was in the annex with the others. "Delva," she said, "I need you to pull the 60-foot det cord from the secondary stores and bring it to the equipment tent. Do not route through the central yard." Delva's voice came back flat with sleep and skepticism. "Chief, it's 20 past 2 in the morning. I know what time it is. Bring the cord and meet me at the equipment tent." A pause on the radio. Then, "Copy that." I sat down across from her and looked at the screen. The red lines were moving, slowly, barely visible if you weren't watching, but moving. "The annex is safe?" I asked. The sensor data shows no anomaly beneath it. The original structure was built over a rock shelf. The tunneling stopped at the shelf edge. The annex sits on solid substrate. She pulled a folded paper from the inside pocket of her jacket. A hand-drawn map, pencil on quadrille paper, marked with depth notations and dates in a small, precise hand. 3 months of mornings, I realized. 3 months of going out before the day got hot and recording what the ground told her, building a picture that nobody had asked for and nobody had read. The demolitions placement needs to go here, here, and here. She touched 3 points on the map. Controlled collapse sequence. The tunnel network folds inward rather than outward. The main structure will drop into the void, but the annex sits outside the collapse radius by 40 meters. You planned for this. I planned for the possibility. She kept her eyes on the map. The sensor data is 9 days old as a warning. If the grid had been broken down last night as ordered, I would have nothing but baseline numbers and a guess. The ground moved at 0304, not the dry settling sound from earlier. A true movement, a slow lurch that I felt in my boots and my back teeth simultaneously, and the lights in the equipment tent swayed on their cables, and somewhere in the central yard something gave way with a sound like a held breath finally released. Through the tent flap, I watched the northeast corner of Building 1 tilt 4 degrees and stop. Then, over the next 40 seconds, drop. The controlled demolition sequence went at 0311, 3 charges, Delva placing them on her coordinates, her voice in his earpiece counting the intervals, steady as a range cadence. The collapse was not dramatic. It was quiet, almost. A subsidence rather than an explosion, the tunnel network folding down on itself the way she had said it would, the main structure going with it in 2 deliberate stages, and then stillness, and then the dust drifted across the dry lake bed and settled, and the compound was 23 people lighter than it had been, and quiet. 23 people walked out of the cinder block annex at 0340 when she cleared the perimeter as safe. Nobody was running. She had not let anyone run. The formal debrief happened at 0900. Breckett ran it himself. By that point, someone had finally pulled her qualification file, her actual file, the classification supplement that had not transferred in the command handover, and Breckett had been reading it for 20 minutes before the debrief began. I watched him read. I watched his face go through several things it was not going to say out loud. The supplement was 14 pages. Combat seismologist, subsurface threat detection and denial, tunnel network identification and controlled collapse operations, 9 confirmed combat engagements across 2 theaters. Primary author of the subsurface threat detection protocol designated CEB/STD4, currently in operational use by 3 engineer brigades. 14 years active duty, 4 years contractor follow-on, call sign, still ground. He read the after-action summary aloud. He read the sensor data log she had compiled from her own equipment over 11 weeks. He read the collapse radius calculation done by hand on quadrille paper. He read the coordinate set Delva had confirmed pre-placement, the timeline from first ground sound to all clear, the structure drop sequence, the safe substrate notation for the annex, a notation she had recorded on day 6 of her deployment, and filed in her own records because no one had asked her to file it anywhere official. When he finished reading, he stood up. She was seated across the table from him, her folded map in front of her, her hands flat on the table on either side of it. She did not stand. Breckett rendered a salute. A full, formal, eyes-front salute, in front of 14 people who had heard him call her the most organized supply clerk on the post, 16 hours before. She did not move. She acknowledged it with a single nod. What I have thought about, in the years since, is not the salute. It is her hands on the table, flat, still, the map between them, and the fact that she did not adjust her posture when he stood. She did not straighten. She did not put her shoulders back. She simply sat the way she had been sitting, and her hands did not move, and she looked at him the way you look at something you have already accounted for, and found approximately where you expected it to be. 3 months of mornings on the dry lake bed, 9 days of watching a pattern nobody else was watching, sensors she had not broken down yet because there had not been time, and because the work was not finished, and because the ground was still telling her something. I think about that often, the 9 days she waited with what she knew, and how she sat at that table, and what her hands looked like on a map she had drawn herself. I have never met anyone who was more certain of the ground beneath her.